the Community Health Department of IU Health. I've been a member of EWHC for almost 10 years, and I'm so excited to have all of you join us today for this very important discussion. I know we all have very busy lives, and we're so grateful that you've chosen to spend the next hour with us today. So a little bit about EWHC. We are the place for women in the Central Indiana healthcare industry to learn from one another, provide educational opportunities, develop leadership skills, and become agents of change in our healthcare industry. So I've learned so much since I joined EWHC as a young MHA graduate student almost 10 years ago, which is hard to say out loud that it's been that long. But I continue to learn so much from the women in our group. And if you are interested in growing both professionally and personally, please connect with us afterwards. You will be receiving a short survey after this event, and it will include contact information for you to learn more. So with that, none of this would be possible without our sponsors. So I'd like to thank the following sponsors that have donated their resources to our group's mission. So at the platinum level, we have Ascension and IU Health Plans. Gold level is BSA Life Structures and Creek DeVault. Silver level is American Structure Point, Core Planning Strategies, Fairbanks, 4-Point Design, Gregory and Appel, Hall Render, IU Executive Education, and Taft. And on the bronze level, we have Drury, Simmons, Bornum, F.A. William, IDEO Incorporated, and Kat Sabermiller. And we have a very special thanks to today's sponsors, which are Taft and IDEO. Kristen Gentry-Kluss, I believe, was going to share some information about Taft Law. Let me just double check if she was able to join us this morning. Kristen, are you there? No, okay. Kristen was not able to join us today, but they are one of our special sponsors for today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speakers today. Thank you again, both Lisa and Todd, for joining us. We're so privileged to have you here for this discussion. Todd Williams joined IU Health in October 28 to serve as Chief Financial Officer for the West Central region, including Arnett Physician Group and Arnett White Memorial and Frankfurt Hospitals. Todd enjoys partnering on regional cultural and diversity and inclusion initiatives, and his role was recently expanded to include executive sponsorship of patient experience. Prior to joining IU Health, Todd served in various vice president roles at Cardinal Health, including leading approximately 500 customer service associates as VP Customer Support Services, VP Program Management, working to integrate acquired businesses in Europe and Latin America, and VP of Finance supporting Cardinal Health's enterprise technology team. Todd's other professional experiences include owning and operating an express employment professional staffing and recruiting franchise, Director of Administration and Enterprise Initiatives and Chief Financial Officer for the Indiana Public Retirement System, various corporate finance roles at Eli Lilly and Company, and a couple of years at Deloitte and Touche. Todd has a Master's in Business Administration and Bachelor's of Science degrees from Indiana University Kelley School of Business. Todd resides in West Lafayette, Indiana, with his wife, Karen, and enjoys spending time with his adult sons, Connor and Luke, whenever possible, and tries to lead an active lifestyle full of music festivals, fitness, and outdoor activities with some good food along the way. Thank you, Todd, for joining us today. Next, we have Lisa Gutierrez, who serves as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Indiana University Health. In this role, she provides strategic direction for the system's ongoing diversity and inclusion efforts. Lisa has a passion for leveraging diversity to help drive business results and serves as a strategic thought partner to all IU Health team members regarding the intersection of diversity, inclusion, innovation, and IU Health's promise of the best care designed for you. More recently, Lisa was the Chief Diversity Officer for Cardinal Health, a $130 billion company with 50,000 employees in 60 countries. She led the development and deployment of strategies to support a diverse and inclusive culture, fostering respect and appreciation for diversity of thought, experience, and background. Prior to Cardinal Health, she launched and led her own consulting firm, LG Strategies, LLC, and served as the Executive Director of Global Diversity at Cummins, Inc. In this role, she led all global diversity and inclusion strategies, including internal consulting, education, and communication to more than 50 countries. Lisa's background also includes more than 15 years at Procter & Gamble, Deloitte Consulting, and the University of California, and a variety of assignments encompassing both line and staff functional experience in 9 different industries. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting us.
So I know a bit about why both of you decided diversity and inclusion. You know, if people hear the topic and wonder what gets someone involved in this to begin with. So I'd love to kind of kick off this discussion today with kind of the why and what for you guys, what prompted you to join this type of work. And this discussion is very open. So EWHC members and guests, please chime in with some questions during this discussion because we want to hear from you guys. So without further ado, thank you both and tell us a little bit about why you guys chose diversity and inclusion.
You want me to start?
Sure.
Actually, I think it chose me. So I was in sales at Procter & Gamble. And I was one of the few women, so this is why I have a fondness for organizations like this. One of the few women selling in really institutional sales. It was like big or little versions of the stuff that you see in the grocery store. And there was hardly any women in there. And we started kind of our own we were the founders. There were a number of us women in sales that were the founders of Women in Sales. And then that led to kind of how do you get multicultural people involved. All of this stemmed for me because the question we were trying to solve was how do you sell more stuff? And at the time, diversity and inclusion was really tied to just let's bring in different people that look different, but nobody was connecting the dots into that and leveraging people's backgrounds as this. How I got into it was I was in sales and we were trying to sell businesses or parts of the business that were failing. One of those was dentists in Orange County, California. Hardly any dentists the dentists that were graduating from dental school were actually Vietnamese, and they weren't buying Crest, they weren't buying Scope, they weren't buying American products, and that business was tanking. And I actually had a male mentee who said, I need help. And it was when we started looking at that part of the business and realizing that we didn't know how to sell to Vietnamese dentists. And it was our Vietnamese salespeople that taught us. And when they taught us how to do it differently, how to tweak the sales process, and the business started going up, suddenly that guy who wasn't Vietnamese started getting calls from our headquarters saying, what are you doing so right that the business is going in a different way? So what triggered for me all this diversity and inclusion work was the belief that everybody's amazing, the belief that everybody has something amazing in their head or their background, and what would happen if we understood it and if we had a chance to leverage it either to innovate, sell differently, solve complex problems. So I've been on that kind of quest. And so for me, it's really been about that. And then thinking about, how do you help if somebody's Vietnamese and somebody's not Vietnamese, how do you leverage both to end up in a better place? So that's part of my why. And so I lucked out that now it's a career. It's actually a career and a day job. So I'm excited about that.
For context, I grew up in Carmel, Indiana, and communities like that. And this was a long time ago, but there was one Black kid out of 2,400 students at the time at Carmel. I wasn't aware of an openly gay person until I was in my mid-20s and working at a building company. So there was nothing about how I grew up that invited the opportunity to embrace diversity, inclusion. I walked through a world of people very much like myself. I've been lucky to work for really good organizations that have invested in D&I. And my first experience with that was at Lilly, and this would have been the better part of 25 years ago. They had what was probably required training, because I don't think I would, I probably would have opted out, but we were required to go to training. And I can picture sitting in this big auditorium, and there were I remember distinctly 3 sessions: the sexual orientation, gender, and race. And I could go on and on about those sessions and still remember them, much of some of the key points from them today. But ultimately, what it made diversity and inclusion really personal. To hear a gay lesbian woman talk about her experience working there, or to talk about, have an African American man, black man, talking about his experience. So the first thing that struck me is, I don't want to fail these people as a human being. The second thing that struck me then is that that the lesbian person in particular was talking about how she had to show up on Monday and filter out all of the words that might have signaled to someone that she was lesbian, and because she was afraid of the consequence of that. And if you realize you're having to do that, you're not bringing your whole self to work. And why I think that's important is, I think good ideas are many ideas. And if we're not allowing people different than ourselves to engage in the same way and bring ideas to the table, then we're not going to be as effective as an organization either. So really, I mean, why D&I boils down to both, one, be a good human being, two, I think it's good business, along the lines of what Lisa said. That really began my journey at Cardinal Health. It was the first time when I really became aware of implicit bias or unconscious bias, and aware of the fact that I walk through the world as a white, straight male. And in so doing, I will inevitably have do things that are contrary to the way I would like to do them if I were a better student, more aware. I became more also aware that I am, and we are, as white men, the problem and need to be part of the solution. I became more empathetic to, some of this goes back to when I left Lilly to go to small business, by the way. So I made an intentional effort to be home more, and by being home more, I was more aware of what my wife did. You know, when I would do one load of laundry and think I was a freaking hero, right? I mean, I realized my wife does this all day, every day. And then I realized, you know, there are women who go through the world with the same expectations at work that people have of me. And I have a stay-at-home wife, you know, mom that makes my lunch, you know, and stuff like that. And I can't imagine trying to do both what I do and if you know, to the extent that women are still supporting their household and their family in traditional ways, I think it's incredible. And so I'm empathetic about that. And how can I impact that? My dad also, I got to give him credit. My dad was a 30-year Lilly guy and ahead of his time, I think, from diversity. And before the book Lean In was cool, my dad had read Lean In and gave me the book Lean In, which I find to be an outstanding resource. And then was part of this Partners Leading Change program at Cardinal, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, today, which was men and how to men support women in leadership roles, and led a book club around that kind of stuff. And then at one time, I thought my official title here at IU Health, it was 2018, by the way, when I joined, was executive buddy for D&I. I kind of liked it. I like the informality of it. I think that title's, I don't know what I am now. What I am is you can't really get rid of me. I like to be a part of it. I partner with our D&I leader, Mallory Walker, and our work here in the region. I'm really, really glad to do so. I'm glad to do so, and I'm glad to be here today because, you know, this is a chance for me to be engaged and become more aware and to learn. I am not here. So I think I'm one of those people that speaks with confidence and energy and like I know and I figured it out. It's really just in case you start to get that idea, that is not true. I am here to learn. And just to make that point, I got a text one time, I got a chat one time from a woman that worked on my team. And it says, it's an enforcement of stereotypes that you went golfing with Alex and my business partner and didn't invite me. If I was male, you never would have excluded me. You would have at least suggested another foursome. That chat came on Tuesday, last Tuesday. So despite a 25-year journey of trying not to screw this up, I continue to screw it up and I want to get better. So here I am.
Thank you, Todd. And don't beat yourself up too much. You know, it took a lot of courage to join this women's group today. So we appreciate you joining it.
Yeah, I've learned to put myself in what potentially awkward circumstances. It's another good point. I think in these circumstances, you can run the risk of going over the line, I think, because we're here to understand and to coach and all that. And I think in real life, it's really hard not to stop so short of the line that you don't ever grow.
But I'll tell you what one of the lines is, okay? So one of the things that I've been doing for years is having an assumption that there's just good people. And Todd and I, and you know, all of you, many of you probably in your organizations that are watching this work for a good organization or work for good people. The assumption I've always had is that there are good people. They might not just know what diversity and inclusion is, or they might not know where they stand on it. That assumption, what you've just heard with Todd, was why this partnership, and we're talking about gender partnership, and we're talking about partnership to help this end game. If it's about diversity, inclusion, equity, you cannot do this without partnership. You just can't. You'll get to a certain point in the journey, but you can't get all the way over the goal line without other people being involved, and not just the people you're trying to help, right? So it's got to be men and women. So this is why I think it's easier actually if you start thinking about people with that assumption of they're pretty darn amazing, I just don't know what they're amazing at. I just always kind of go, you're somebody's amazing, and is there a way to do something amazing together, right? But let's see what's interesting to them, and let's see what's interesting to you, and how do we work it together? And that's why partnership is a critical word for me in this work.
Both. Yeah, so talking a little bit about that with the partnership, again, it's gender partnerships for the discussion today. What are some experiences that maybe you guys have that you could share, whether they be good, bad, or indifferent conversations that you've had, or examples of possibly a lack of partnership, or a good example? I mean, either or.
I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Todd, because I came into movies. So when I got hired at Cardinal Health, we had a gender partnership strategy going on for about 7 years prior to me getting there. And to Todd's point, we had invested in conversations. We had invested in a training which was called Women Leading Change, and we had invested in a training called Partners Leading Change, which is for men. So it had been going well. There had been good conversations. But one of the things that I noticed, and this happens in diversity and inclusion all the time, is we silo the conversations, right? We will have a siloed conversation to talk, for example, about race. We'll go talk to African Americans or Black, but we won't talk to other people on how race is impacting them. So there might be white people, men and women, for example, that have biracial children or grandchildren, or are married to somebody of a different race, and it's affecting their life as well, right? But we just kind of exclude them. So coming into that, I mean, I found a cadre of amazing men like Todd and some amazing women, but it was also getting stuck. So one of the things that we decided to do was to actually start doing a training together to see if we could accelerate the conversation. Because what would happen is that you have the men having a conversation, which was really impactful. You have the women having a conversation that was really impactful, but it would take a while before they talk to each other and figure out what was going on. Now at Deloitte, I didn't realize Todd had Deloitte in his background as well, but at Deloitte, when I was the Diversity Programs Director for Americas there, we were at the time doing what was called Men and Women as Colleagues, and we actually did it together. And I saw how fast that aha happened when you could hear in the room directly, oh, like what Todd is saying, that's what my colleague is feeling. That's what's going on. So what we did was we then restructured kind of that partnership, and really kind of wanted to make sure that we were really collectively going in the same direction. So we started doing co-ed, and those even got higher scores than the separate ones. We restructured the, think of it as the solutions team or the overarching organization that managed some of that work. It turns out we had some of that, but most of the men weren't included. We had been focusing just on women in that executive team. And I remember some of the men came behind the scenes to me and they said, Lisa, if this is really about partnership, why am I not involved in that? So we restructured that kind of management group, and it became 60% women, 40% men, because you also want to look at the research and realize that if you made it exactly 50-50, the women's voices sometimes get quieter. So we wanted the women's voices to be stronger using some of that gender research. So it was just really powerful. So I think a key message for us is start somewhere, but be open to accelerating your journey or adapting your journey. You know, if you're kind of getting stuck. The same thing happened when we started the women's group. I was at Procter & Gamble. Our goal was to have 51% women in sales. We achieved 51% women in sales. And then the group started fracturing because it was so many women that they started focusing on women with children, women without children, women with dual career partners. And you realize that the group was no longer as valuable to people in a big group way. So we had to kind of, you know, create like separate little focus groups so that people could really get the needed information that they needed to help their career move forward. So, you know, women of color, for example, in women's groups were saying, this group is really good, but what about me as a woman of color? And they were orienting and sometimes to affinity groups that were more about color and ethnic and race. And we were trying to figure out how do you intersect what's going on with women there to a women's group. So a lot of that kind of connection of just being agile and being willing to adapt if you're thinking about your client group. So I'll send it back to Todd because he had been involved in Partners Leading Change for a lot longer than when I came in.
Yeah, so the partner leading change, I mean, picture a bunch of men in our room basically talking about women in leadership. And so the power to those sessions was when we finally got together in the same room, in my opinion. We can, again, we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go through the morning here, but another example where I've partnered, so Mallory Walker, Mallory happens to be a Black nurse practitioner here in our region and an incredible person who just finds unbelievable ways to give to the organization and the community. But I've been, because of this executive buddy, been privileged to work with her. I think I think one thing, I think being a white, when I show up as a white straight male trying to co-lead a diversity thing, I hope that's impactful, because I'm not sure what you expect to be up there talking about it. But you know, again, it gets to dialogue, and Mallory and I just kind of have this back and forth conversation. Maybe Lisa and I might, that helps sort of pull out the stories and the relevance to what we do. We've done a lot of things over the course of about the last 15 months or so. But one, I guess I can talk to you about sort of, it's, I think, a good and maybe a bad experience, Kylie. One of the areas of my responsibility is physician compensation, at least in the administration of that. And we pay physicians in our region up here to provide certain administrative leadership kinds of roles. And we pay 59 of our doctors in some capacity or another for that work. Guess what percent of those are women? 12, 9 out of 59 are women. And then we started, there were some women physicians who were talking about other gender biases that showed up in their work. And I felt like I need to explain why I should be why I'd like to be in the conversation with women providers and other women, and they embrace, you know, but I had to build that trust, I think, first, or demonstrate that. But one of the things that we learned was that, a lot of times, because of the way physicians work, meetings have to be early or late. Well, if you picture a 7 o'clock meeting and you have these household responsibilities, you're trying to get the kids on the bus, or you picture a 5:30 meeting at night and you're trying to, you know, get meals done for the family or something, you've just made it really hard for a female physician to play these roles where these meetings happen to convene then, particularly when the expectation was that they meet in person. So we've talked about, anyway, can we keep teams as a way that these various forums meet, and can we consider other times of day that might allow then women to opt in more often, to the extent that's the issue. To the extent that women are opting out, we can maybe solve for that. I will tell you though, so one of the other things that Mallory and I have been doing is kind of going on road shows, and we're getting invited into various committees and stuff, right? So the nurses team, or the advanced practitioner team, or the MA team. Well, one of those was the Arnett physician group. And so it's a group of, I don't know, 15 or 20 of our leaders amongst the physician team. And we went through diversity. We shared the various biases that we all have. And at the end of it, I pointed out, I mean, look at your agenda today. You're going to vote today on board members and a new board member and a new compensation committee member. And the list has 12 names, and there's one woman on the whole list. You know, I'd like you to consider the conversation about how you spend the rest of the morning. Really trying to challenge and say, can we throw that out and we'll start over, we'll get our list together. Well, we got into the discussion. I mean, so we went through the rest of the agenda, and we got into that part of this conversation, and the leader said, should we wait and postpone our vote until next time and try and get other women to participate? And you know what happened? A woman doctor said, I think we had to just vote today. I was like, you'd let the whole air out of the balloon. And her point was, we've already kind of, you know, tried, and we're not going to have a different answer in 2 months and all that kind of stuff. But I was so disappointed that we didn't rise to the challenge. Our chief medical officer, who is a man, because someone would say, it's going to be awkward if we don't vote, and we go back up to the group and look for names. And I thought it was brilliant. He said, I mean, it's the awkwardness that makes the impact. I mean, we go back and say wasn't done right. So Anyway, good that we're having a conversation. Good that I think we're sharing the data. Good that we're figuring out, are women not leaning into the opportunity, and is there a reason why they're not leaning it in other than not having the invitation to the table? Bad that I thought we were at a point where we might change things and we didn't, so got to go try again.
Thank you for sharing, Todd. I think you bring up an excellent point too with women. I was speaking with a hospital leadership female last year about this, and she said, we had this great C-suite position open, and guess how many women applied for it within IU Health? And I said, how many? 20? She said 0.
Yeah.
So I think we also have to counterbalance that with our women self-sabotage, self-promotion, all these things that we constantly, struggle with as well. I think we need to take ownership in leaning in and doing these things that can really help accelerate our careers as well. To your point, getting a seat at the table, make sure we're meeting each other halfway. So
yeah, one of the aha moments for me, and I think it may be from leaning in, we talked about it a lot at Cardinal Health, and Mike Kaufman, their CEO, was a great champion of diversity and inclusion, and he talked about a lot was, if there's a job description that goes out and there's 5 requirements, and women have 4, a woman has 4 of the 5, she's likely to say, well, I got to wait till I get the 5th, and if I've got 1 of the 5, I'm like, I'm your guy. And what that teaches me practically is we and there's a question in some of the prep, but is I need to be recruiting women in to the conversation, because they may not invite themselves in or raise their hand or self-promote. So I think as one thing you got to keep in mind, I think I try to keep in mind as a recruiting perspective is that, so that I know that I've got to be more inclusive in the ask to build a good solid candidate pool, including people and women maybe more so than not that are qualified and wouldn't have considered themselves to be.
And I call that sometimes it's minority female brain. But minorities also do the same thing, right? The research behind it is called divergent thinking or convergent thinking. Particularly men are more convergent thinkers. Women, we might be thinking all the dots. Well, if I get that job, then that might affect this, and and then we end up at the place where we decide to not apply. Just last week, in the past 3 weeks, I've had 2 or 3 conversations with women saying, let somebody else give you the rejection. Don't give yourself the rejection first. Just go, and then whatever that you find out will help guide your development plan, right? If you get a piece of information that says you're not quite ready, but you're just missing this, then it gives us a better recipe on how to develop. But we tend to do that. That's why I tell people sometimes I think like a guy. Sometimes I think like a guy like Todd, just going, you know what? I'm going to apply for that and see what happens. That's what's neat about the differences, right? If that can engage you in that confidence of saying, you know what? I know he's good and I think I'm just as good. I'm going to apply and see what happens. And then you decide. There's nothing that you can always say that's not right for me right now. But when to your point, Todd and Kylie, if nobody's applying, then it's hard for somebody to say, well, I didn't give them the option of applying. And then I agree with Todd. You have to go out and reach and say, hey, I just put out a posting. I've done that again. And I've noticed that you didn't apply. We've had these conversations. You've asked about my job. Why haven't you applied? And then you find out, and then you do some things like that. Somebody in the chat also had a question, so I thought I'd address that, is if you witness discrimination or bias, how do you address it? And do you tell the person it's discriminatory, say, that's not cool, or console the person being discriminated? What response do you recommend? Todd shared some. For me, I think, let me just tell you, in this space, in the D&I space, it's different in very many than any other topic, because almost everybody is afraid of being wrong in it, and everybody's afraid of making a mistake, 100%. And I've made mistakes in lots of countries, by the way. So you have to kind of get over that and figure out the process. I always learn I'm sorry in every language. I've traveled to 31 countries, and that's one of the first things I learn in their language is I'm sorry, because I know I'm going to make a bunch of mistakes. What you do first is, I think if you understand that and know that you're going to tell somebody, you're going to give people feedback, I always say, hey, I just observed something, and I know you're such an amazing person or good leader, and it might be a blind spot. Are you open to a little bit of feedback? on a blind spot. See, everybody's open to feedback on a blind spot. People are not open to feedback on you suck at this thing, right? And you're terrible at it. But if you say you've got a blind spot and also you put in that context of I care about you, you're my colleague, you're my friend. I've done it with my brother, which by the way is hard. And one of the things I told my brother, he made a pejorative comment about a group of people. And I said, this is what I told him. I said, you know what? I love you so much. And this is not what you really believe. But now there's a bunch of people that believe that about you. Is that what you want them to believe about you? That you're racist? And he's like, no, I don't. And I said, okay. He goes, what did you notice? And he said, so I told him that. And then I said, how do we change it? You know, and I said, I think you need to go apologize and let people know that you've acknowledged it. So we've got a lot of leaders that have been so cool and that have acknowledged something. One of the big things that came up this summer was Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And we had a lot of leaders that were sitting there going, I don't know what that means. And one got some great feedback from a person of color. And then not only did he accept the feedback, apologize, but then he told his whole region about what his learning was. And what he found was he got even more support by being that vulnerable. So it's also counterintuitive in the D&I space. You know, telling people you're vulnerable and telling people you don't know something is opposite of what, you know, I worked with scientists. They were the PhDs. They were the top 1, 2, or 3 in the world. And they were expected to know things. And in the D&I space, you're expected to know some things, but you're still expected to lead. So I hope that answers that question for M. Rogers. But I think the big thing is to really, part of it is how you approach people and allow them to want to learn more and to learn differently.
I can answer that from the other side, actually, a little bit too. So, you know, the chat I read from you, if you asked Amanda, it's the woman's name that works for me now, about me, I think she would have a lot of really good things to say. So while I am vocal about that on my D&I journey, and that I'm not perfect, and I want to get better. And so she knew that I would value that feedback as much as I don't like failing at that.
Yeah.
I was grateful that she would give it to me. And the other example, when I was leading one of these book clubs back at Cardinal, a woman was saying it's hard to do that. It's hard to give that feedback. And I'm like, I would be embarrassed to, you know, walk through the world continuing to make that same mistake again. You know, and so you find out who your friends are when, you know, hey, you got something on your chin or whatever. You know, who's going to call that out? Well, and so it sort of struck her that, oh, I hadn't thought about that way. So it allowed her to I hope, you know, be more proactive in terms of coaching people, because, you know, I mean, we need it. The white Mallory and I led a book club on white fragility, and it talks about in there, one of the things it says is, I mean, feedback, if white people in this context were just open to and acted on the feedback that they're offered, it would be revolutionary, which feels like a really low bar. Is all we got to do is, you know, take feedback in a more meaningful way. But you know, we need the feedback. And I think in particularly, like, for example, in race, is how, you know, what is my opportunity even to have a feedback loop there? Because I'm not surrounded by Black people very often. And so how do you, so that feedback is, you know, the feedback is a gift thing. I really believe it's true. And there may not be many opportunities to coach people. And how long can I wait again for someone to have the courage to say what needs to be said? Lisa also used the word language. I think that having a common language, so there's also discussion about in your organization. So, you know, I think about if any of you had read the 5 love languages with your spouse or partner or whatever, I think it's a great book. Well, I think it's a great book because it gives you a common language. I'm like, you know, sweetheart, I could use a little bit of quality time here. And she might say, well, how about an act of service or two first? And, but you know, it gives you a common language. And I think it also gives you then an expectation both to coach and to be coached using that language. IU Health has our values: purpose, excellence, compassion, and team. I think establishing, if you think about strength finders, right, it becomes like, hey, dude, you're overplaying that whole, you know, ranger thing. And I think a common language helps make it a safe place. And I kind of, the way I think is it, the person here said, you know, that's not cool. I think it makes it more of a casual conversation. Like, dude, that's not cool. You know, you why wouldn't you invite me to play golf?
Right. Thank you, Todd. And it looks like we have another question kind of related. What's the best way to champion D&I when you are on a team that doesn't prioritize it or doesn't think they can make any impact with it? Thank you, Christy.
Christy, I'll start here. I've built my career on a theory, and so far it's working. But the theory is that you have to build D&I into the actual rhythm of your work. I'm talking about organizational diversity. I'm talking about what your work is. So at Procter & Gamble, again, the rhythm was sales and marketing. So by building in D&I into that rhythm, you suddenly had everybody wanting to sell differently because the market was changing. At the time when I was doing it, the market was changing. There wasn't an ethnic foods aisle in the Kroger's in California. That was 1995 or so. So there were Asian grocery stores, there were Mexican bodegas. So we had a bunch of salespeople that their sales were going down because people were buying differently and they had no idea what to do. It wasn't until we tweaked how to sell that process. So I think you have to go with whatever the rhythm is. At IU Health, our rhythm is directly tied to patient care. You cannot ignore that. So if you take the COVID-19 rhythm earlier this year, we had been working on a lot of diversity strategies and a variety of things. We all had to shift to focus on COVID-19. We're getting ready for a second surge, right? Or for flu season. To ignore that and to pretend that somebody else's brain space is not equally important, you have to get clear. And so for me, I always orient diversity and inclusion to the organization's mission, your vision. Todd mentioned it, the values. Those are the overarching things. And there's always a strategy that your organization wants. At Cardinal Health, when we were both there, the actual real strategy was an acquisition strategy. I was there for 4 years and we acquired 40 companies in 4 years. You can't do mandatory diversity training with a company that's trying to come on board and figure out how they get paid. You know, they're just like focused on how do I get paid? They're freaking out. They belonged to another company a day ago. Now they're your company. So we focused on inclusion strategies. So I think what you have to do a little bit is really also understand the business of your business and really get clear. And I do see a lot of people, not just women, but men and women, not really understanding what their whole business is about and how it plays out. When I worked at the University of California, it was R&D and it was a national laboratory tied to national security. All the money that came in, the primary clients or customers were Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and National Institutes of Health. There were technicians lower in the organization that did not really realize that their FTE or their job was linked to that chunk of change that came in from that customer. And so when we were working different strategies, I spent a little bit of time just saying, okay, do you understand how business happens? Do you understand why you have a job now, but it could go away in a year because this is when the contract is up? People do not understand the business of the business. So I highly recommend to think about that and to connect some dots. And when you start doing that, what starts happening is when you start solving business problems that are business problems anyway, and you think about it with a diversity lens on it, it might be that women can solve it. It might be that Gen Z has figured it out. It might be that your boomers have an idea that worked 20 years ago and now the organization is ready for it. Whatever it is, it could be your LGBTQ population that's figured it out. It's figuring those things out, but understanding the business of the business. So I'm a fan of recognizing your business rhythm, and then being open to shifting based on the business rhythm. And I'll close this out with this last story. When I was at Cummins, the business rhythm at Cummins is a Six Sigma rhythm. So diversity and inclusion is about increasing variation. Six Sigma is about reducing variation. But in the methodology, there's places to increase variation. So what we did was figure out how do you build in a variation somewhere in the process, eventually to reduce it and take things over the goal line. So I would say a big thing is when people don't know what to do with D&I, I would bet sometimes you're talking about it outside of that rhythm, and people might be like, oh, I can't figure out, do you want me to do this or do you want me to do that? And by helping them figure it out, you know, Todd's a CFO, so he probably thinks also about, you know, his CFO responsibilities in doing this. So I don't think you can do it in an either or way. I think you have to build it into some of that rhythm.
There's no doubt it has business impact. I was in a kind of a training session with the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kinsey, I believe is the name. And he actually, the professor that was facilitating shared a story when you go, if you go to the restrooms and you have the faucets that read your hands and the water comes out, apparently some of those weren't set where it reads black hands. And so, you know, I mean, first of all, again, it's just, I mean, I can't imagine that that's the experience you have, and it's just another piece of evidence that you're Black and not white. But if you think about the whole, you know, was there representation in the engineering team that put all that stuff together? But I still, you know, to me, you know, it's still personal to me. I would say, make it personal and tell stories and create the opportunity for that. Because, you know, if nothing else, I think, I mean, that's what got my attention. And then you can grow, I think, from a business perspective. One of the things that Mallory and I did when we last June, a year and a half ago, we hosted a D&I town hall, and we didn't really know exactly what we were going to do, but we had a brown bag lunch. We probably had 100 people show up of all sorts. I mean, doctors and everybody else. And I found this thing called a thumb ball from a place called Trainer's Warehouse. And so it's like a soccer ball, and on every little piece of the soccer ball, it has a question. And the idea is you throw the ball around, and where your thumb lands, you read and answer that question. So it was a fun way to get involved in it. We didn't have to sit there and try to figure out what question to ask. And it didn't take about 3 times before all of a sudden the conversation is naturally flowing. But it's one example where you can just get people in a room and just start talking and see where it goes. And I suspect that you'll be really amazed at how vulnerable people are and how open they are. That's been our experience here, really pleasantly. So.
Thank you for sharing, Todd. I love that idea. What did you say that was called? A thumb ball?
Called a thumb ball. I'll put it in the chat from
Okay.
Trainer's Warehouse, and I can read the phone number. I'll even put that there for you.
Awesome. Thank you. So this leads into, I mean, I know we have just a few more minutes here together, and I just wanted to get into some of the practical tips and takeaways. And thank you for the chat. This actually leads into one of the questions. So I know we have possibly I know we have a lot of leaders on this call in different healthcare organizations. There may be some that are new leaders, or this concept is new to them as leaders. What is your advice for them, whether that includes staff reviews to helping incorporate this kind of discussion? What can they be doing as leaders in the industry to really help catalyst or move this conversation going forward with their employees?
I'll bounce off of using the ball, the pun intended. I'll bounce off of Todd. I think you have to figure out yourself a little bit, right? Figure out some of your biases, and they aren't all unconscious, by the way. They're conscious. So I'll give you an example of a conscious bias that I know I had, but I was the person that was making the hiring decisions. After they went to the universities, they would bring them back, and so there were 2 interviews at Procter & Gamble. I was the 3rd one, and whoever I said yes to got a job offer, whoever didn't. So I was doing this presentation, and I mentioned my biases, and I said I had a bias against men and women in fraternities and sororities. And I had a lot of women raise their hand, and they're like, what, you know, but you hired me. And I go, yes. I said, but how many of you had 4 interviews instead of 3? And many of them raised their hand because I wasn't sure, right? I was the resident advisor in the dorms after Rush, that everybody would come back crying because they didn't get into their sorority or fraternity that they wanted. So I was the one that had to kind of put them back together. So I knew why I had a bias. I knew what my bias was. The mitigation was making sure there was another interview with somebody else to say, I think this person is great. I think Kylie is great, but I'm not sure if my bias is playing out. So can somebody else please interview her just to make sure? So that's, I think a big part of it is first understanding yourself. And Todd mentions that about, you know, just go to different things, go to topics, you know, go to presentations in the community that you normally wouldn't go, or you'd be like, well, I want to go, but you know, it's about Black or race and I'm afraid. Well, go, right? Just go to learn and try things. So I started doing that. The second thing I'd really is assess your go-to group of people. So like if you have projects or maybe you've got some things that you need to do, who's your go-to group of people? It might be about 4 people that you naturally start calling. You start thinking, oh, if I give them this, I know I don't have to worry about it. They'll just get it done. Start looking at your go-to group people and realizing in many cases, you'll probably realize that they're a lot like you. So start diversifying your go-to group of people. Start saying, what other brains am I missing? And where are they, right? And that's when I started thinking about brains that were in India or brains that were in China. And I started connecting with them, but I would have to talk to them in a different time zone. I'd have to send more presentations that were pictures and less words, right? So that they could get the sense of it. And I started getting kind of diversity coaches or coaches of my strategies from out and about in the world. With scientists, I got the 2 scientists that that hated HR, they hated business people, but every other scientist loved them. So they became my mini board of directors, and they would review my stuff. And then the 5,000 scientists I was working with would say, well, what did Frank and Fred say? And I'd be like, Fred hated everything. And I'm like, Frank was a little bit more neutral. They knew that was real. So I think you know, if you diversify your go-to group, if you understand what Todd and I are talking about, is you got to understand some of yourself first and start making it personal, but saying, why does that bother me? Why does that person, every time they ask a question, why is it irritating to me? And it could be that it triggers maybe a person you worked with 5 years ago that bothers you. And then just start leaning in to understand yourself, but then understand others. So those are my two favorites. And then the third one, I'll just say this is, I already put it in the chat, but figure out your day job and think about any business problems you have, and then just see, could some of those business problems be solved by a diverse group of people looking at it? Because that's what the research shows. The research shows that the more differences you have looking at a problem, you are likely to find a better solution. And many times that solution will save you money, bring you in money, or do something. So I have a natural math thing in my head going, okay, whose brains am I missing? You know, if I'm talking about an international thing, do I have international people helping to look at the problem? And sometimes we don't do that. So those are my tactical things. Todd, back to you.
Probably a bit redundant, you know, make it public, so get the conversation going, and representation matters. I think I stole this term from Lisa, but the double Rooney rule, you know, the Rooney rule from football, where you have to have a minority or a diverse candidate on a panel, on your candidate panel, but also ought to have that on your interview panel, so that you can call out and recognize the biases and things that show up. There's a question, by the way, in the chat about how does IU Health incorporate staff reviews into helping women and minorities advance. I can't help but tell a story about Cardinal Health. I worked for Patty Morrison, really strong woman leader, chief information officer, and we were looking at some of the data around women and how often they were promoted into leadership roles, and we saw that at every layer of leadership there were fewer and fewer women that were promoted. So somebody asked a question like, are they rated less strong, you know, in performance reviews? So we went back and looked at data, and women were actually rated higher than men, and yet promoted at a lower rate. And there we had talent reviews that were structured around diverse candidates. At IU Health, we're
starting that.
Yeah. So I mean, Dennis Murphy our president has come out with a strategic approach, a commitment that's really around how we, my simple language would be about how we as individuals within our organization, how we as individuals work differently to promote diversity and inclusion, how we as an organization whole improve, and then how do we as IU Health organization impact the community at large around D&I efforts. But the specifics of what's next, Lisa maybe can talk to you better.
Yeah, so talent reviews, the way you do that is through a process called talent reviews. And at IU Health, we're really building the infrastructure around general talent reviews. So we've done some of that. But some of these organizations, again, are further along in this journey on talent reviews and processes. And then what you want to do is you want to intersect in what Todd is talking about, is thinking about an unconscious bias or a bias coach. We built in bias coaches into the process so they could say, hey, here's what I won't share the company, but here's an example. We had verged the other way so strongly to help women, you know, to say, okay, we want to balance out, this woman is really great, and she also has, you know, a family and stuff like this. So can we adjust the workload to basically give her the promotion? Same discussion happened with a man, and he was a single dad, and he was there, and I was the bias coach in that conversation, and they had skipped over, and they basically said, well, he's working really long hours, he can do it. And I said, I find it interesting that we adapted the workload for the female, but we did not do it for the male. And that's where we kind of stopped the conversation, and people are like, oh, wow, I had, you know, again, bias can work in various ways. And we had, the bias and the assumption was men can do it and they can handle it. We had not built in the thinking of he's a single dad as well. So he's got the same requirements in terms of family structure. And so those are the kinds of things that you want to think about in talent review processes, not to just help some people versus others, but really to think about how do we adapt or flex the work so that we can help men and women get promoted. And what you find a lot of times, Todd started out the conversation, is that a lot of women are also the primary caregivers, or single dads are the caregivers. And they might be struggling with how to balance that and still get the promotion, still do the job. We've had in one organization, when we started looking at the data, we had a lot of people turning down promotions at a certain, I call it a phase of life. It was the phase of life where they were nesting. They were nesting and starting to have young children. And they would say, I do want it, but can you wait, till my kid's in first grade or something like that, which was about a 3 to 4 year period. So when you start intersecting phases of life research and really understand that, then you can also figure out, sometimes you may be able to promote somebody in place or promote somebody. So Christina Chapman is our amazing Chief Learning Officer, and she's doing a lot of that work in terms of strategy and thinking about how do we build that, not only for our most senior leader positions, but all the way down to manager and above.
Thank you, Lisa.
One thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. One thing we've talked about in the conversation, but not explicitly. So if depending on where you are with your organization, I would say say the data and share the data. I mean, my 25 or whatever year career, I don't know that I've ever been explicitly a part of or aware of a conversation that was biased in terms of someone's promotion or pay or those sorts of things. And yet, when you look at the data, it's clear that happens. And so I think that if you walk through the world, you say, well, I don't think we're, disadvantaging women. Well, then why are only 9 of 59 women on the being paid? So I think the data matters because it's not as obvious, maybe. I mean, as a white straight male, it's not as obvious to me how these biases show up every day in the workplace. Now, that's probably, again, because I work with a really white straight male. But there is no refuting the fact that it clearly does, or we wouldn't have the data that we have. And so I think that's another approach you can take.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, I think it's very important, and sometimes it's difficult for people to figure out how to get their hands on that data, but we know it's out there, and connecting internally with your manager or leadership to collect that, I think is really important. So we have about 5 minutes left. I know we have some wrap up for next events and things like that, but I did want to leave it on. Again, thank you both so much for your time today. I know we're on the tip of the iceberg of this discussion, and I really appreciate the audience and asking questions. Is there anything, Todd and Lisa, like a final resource or takeaway that you'd like to give to our audience before we move on to some of the closing out items?
The takeaway for me is, honestly, there is no way to do world-class diversity and inclusion or world-class gender partnership without the men.
Yep.
We can't do it without the men. For people of color, we can't do it without majority or white, with our white colleagues. Indiana is 80% white. Okay, so if I'm working on D&I of color or ethnic, there's no way to do it. So be thinking about that and just think like a math problem. Who am I missing to help? And then how do you engage, understand from their perspective, what they're worried about as well.
Thank you. Todd?
I just say create the conversation, make it public that you want as an organization and as an individual to be more aware of and more not just aware. I mean, one of the things, awareness isn't enough, right? So I need to be aware. So then what are we going to do about it? And all that stuff that's maybe more aware to people with different or less privilege, create the opportunity for that to be shared. I think it snowballs from there.
Great. Thank you again, both so much. And I think we have, I don't know if Joelle was going to share a slide or not, but we have a couple events that are coming up for Executive Women in Healthcare. The next one is again, virtual events through year end. Healthcare disruptors are here to stay. Let's embrace change. That'll be November 12th. And then we have a December drive-by gift wrapping where we'll be donating to a different charity or organization within Indiana. And then also we have a call out for a special committee task force. We need and would love advice on events for 2021. So if you are interested in that, again, you'll receive an email for everybody that signed up with some additional information. including a survey for today, and then our upcoming calendar events, and of course, ways if you want to become a member. So I know we can't hear all of you, but join me in just a round of applause for Lisa and Todd. You guys did an amazing job. And again, we can't talk about this enough. So we really appreciate your time today and your insights. So with that, getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, but anyway, enjoy the rest of your Monday, guys.
Thank you.